What happens when two ordinary women walk into a place where everyone fears to tread? What happens when whispered warnings become deadly prophecies? In the remote mountains of Colorado, there stands a military installation that has broken more spirits than any war ever could. For decades, soldiers have quit, officers have transferred, and even the toughest Marines have requested immediate reassignment. The locals call it the graveyard, not because people die there, but because careers, reputations, and sanity go to rest in its shadow. No one had ever conquered this base. No one had ever made it bend to their will. That is until two twin sisters arrived on a cold October morning, carrying nothing but determination and a secret that would change everything. The morning fog clung to the mountains like a shroud as the black sedan wound its way up the treacherous mountain road. Inside the vehicle, Sarah Mitchell stared out at the dense pine forests while her twin sister, Rebecca, reviewed the thick manila folder one last time. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. After 34 years of shared existence, they had learned to communicate without words. But today, even their telepathic connection seemed strained by the weight of what lay ahead. Fort Meridian, Rebecca finally spoke, her voice cutting through the engine's hum. Established 1943, decommissioned 1967, reactivated 1982 for special operations training. She flipped through pages of reports, each one more damning than the last. 47 commanding officers in 40 years. Average tenure, 8 months. Sarah turned from the window, her green eyes meeting her sister's identical gaze. They had inherited their mother's sharp features and their father's military bearing. But where Sarah was fire, Rebecca was ice. Where Sarah charged ahead, Rebecca calculated every move. Together they were unstoppable. At least, that's what their superiors believed when they assigned them to this impossible mission. "Tell me about the last commander," Sarah said. Though she already knew the answer would be grim, Rebecca's finger traced down a page until she found the entry. Colonel Marcus Webb, decorated veteran, 3 tours in Afghanistan, impeccable record. Lasted 6 weeks before requesting immediate transfer to a desk job in Nebraska. She looked up. He specifically requested never to be assigned to any leadership position again. The sedan rounded another curve, and suddenly Fort Meridian came into view. Perched on a plateau like a concrete crown, the military base sprawled across several acres of flattened mountaintop. Guard towers rose from each corner, their searchlights already scanning the approaching vehicle despite the early hour. The main gate stood like a mouth with metal teeth, and beyond it a collection of utilitarian buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the wind that never stopped blowing at this altitude. "Cheerful place," Sarah muttered, but her tone carried no humor. Their driver, a young corporal who had been silent for the entire 3-hour journey, finally spoke. "Ma'am, I'm instructed to tell you that there's still time to reconsider. General Patterson said to remind you that there's no shame in requesting a different assignment." The twins exchanged a look that would have frozen lesser mortals. Rebecca closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Corporal, please inform General Patterson that the Mitchell sisters don't back down from challenges. We solve them." As their sedan approached the main gate, Sarah could see the guards emerging from their booth. Even from a distance, their body language screamed reluctance. These weren't fresh-faced recruits eager to impress new commanding officers. These were seasoned soldiers who had watched too many careers crash and burn on this very spot. The guard who approached their window was a master sergeant with dead eyes and 3 decades of military service etched into every line of his weathered face. He examined their credentials with the thoroughness of a man who had long since stopped caring about protocol, but continued following it out of habit. "Welcome to Fort Meridian," he said, though his tone suggested they were anything but welcome. "I'm Master Sergeant Rodriguez. I've been here longer than anyone should be, and I'll probably be here long after you're gone." He handed back their IDs. "Fair warning, ma'am, this place eats commanding officers for breakfast." Sarah leaned forward, her voice deadly quiet. "Sergeant, I appreciate the warning, but you should know something about us. We don't get eaten. We do the eating." For the first time in years, something flickered in Rodriguez's eyes. Not quite hope, but perhaps the distant memory of what hope used to feel like. He stepped back and waved them through the gate. The base revealed itself in layers as they drove deeper into its maze of buildings and training grounds. Everything was regulation perfect, too perfect. The grass was cut to exactly the right length, the buildings painted in precisely the correct shade of military beige, and every vehicle parked with mathematical precision. It was the kind of perfection that screamed dysfunction, the kind of order that masked chaos. Their sedan stopped in front of the administration building, a concrete monolith, that looked like it had been designed by someone who actively hated the concept of joy. As they stepped out, Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of unseen eyes watching their every move. Windows that had appeared empty suddenly showed the shadows of faces peering down at them. "They're sizing us up," Rebecca observed quietly. "Let them look," Sarah replied. "They'll learn soon enough." The corporal who had driven them up the mountain hurried to unload their bags, his movements quick and nervous. As he set the last suitcase on the ground, he looked up at them with something approaching pity. "Ma'am, if you need an emergency evacuation, there's a radio in the command center. Someone monitors it 24/7. Sarah's laugh was sharp as mountain air. "Corporal, the only thing we'll be evacuating is the problem that's been festering here for 40 years. The young man nodded, but his expression remained doubtful. He climbed back into the sedan and drove away quickly, leaving the twins standing alone in front of the building that had swallowed so many careers whole. The administration building's interior was a monument to bureaucratic misery. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly green tint. The walls were lined with photographs of previous commanding officers. 47 faces that told a story of gradual defeat. Some smiled confidently in their early photos, others looked tired before they even began. But all shared the same hollow look of men and women who had been broken by something they couldn't understand or control. At the reception desk sat a civilian secretary who looked like she had been carved from the same granite as the mountain itself. She glanced up from her typewriter, an actual typewriter, not a computer, and studied the twins with the expression of a mortician evaluating her next clients. "You must be the new commanding officers," she said, making it sound like a terminal diagnosis. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. I've been the administrative secretary here for 19 years. 19 years? Rebecca asked, genuinely impressed. "You've outlasted every commanding officer we've had?" Mrs. Henderson's smile was thin and sharp. "Oh yes, I've seen them all come and go. Young ones, old ones, male, female, experienced, green. Doesn't matter. This place has a way of finding what breaks a person." Sarah stepped forward, her presence filling the room like a sudden storm. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to understand something. My sister and I didn't come here to become another photograph on your wall of failures. We came here to fix whatever's broken in this place, and we're not leaving until we do." The older woman studied Sarah for a long moment, then shifted her gaze to Rebecca, who stood silent but equally intimidating. Finally, "Mrs. Omigu," Henderson nodded slowly. "Well then, you'll be wanting to see your quarters and get the briefing. Though I should warn you, the last 3 COs didn't make it through their first briefing before requesting transfers." She led them through a maze of corridors that seemed designed to confuse and demoralize. Every turn looked identical, every door was painted the same shade of institutional beige, and the fluorescent lights created shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. It was psychological warfare by architecture. And Sarah began to understand how this place could break someone before they even encountered any human opposition. Their quarters were on the 3rd floor, a suite of rooms that had been hastily converted from separate offices. The furniture was regulation issue, and arranged with the kind of soulless precision that spoke of desperate attempts to maintain control in an uncontrollable situation. 2 identical desks faced each other across the main room, and behind them, a window offered a view of the training grounds where small groups of soldiers moved through exercises with the enthusiasm of pallbearers. "The previous CO had these rooms joined, Mrs. Walkim," Henderson explained, gesturing around the space. "He said he needed to be able to coordinate with his executive officer at all times. Lasted 2 weeks after the renovation was complete." Rebecca moved to one of the desks and began unpacking her briefcase with methodical precision. "Mrs. Henderson, we'll need to see all personnel files, training records, incident reports, and efficiency evaluations for the past 5 years. All of them?" The secretary's eyebrows rose. "That's over 3,000 files." "All of them," Sarah confirmed. "And we'll need them organized by date, rank, and department. Can you have that ready by tomorrow morning?" Mrs. Henderson looked like she wanted to argue, then seemed to remember something and nodded curtly. "I'll have my staff work through the night if necessary." After the secretary left, the twins stood in silence, absorbing the oppressive atmosphere of their new domain. Through the window, they could see soldiers moving through their training exercises, but something was wrong with the picture. It took Sarah a moment to identify what bothered her about the scene below. "They're going through the motions," she said finally. Rebecca joined her at the window. "No pride, no precision, no purpose. They're just marking time until they can leave." "Look at the instructors." Sarah pointed to a group of NCOs supervising a weapons training exercise. "They're not teaching. They're just watching. No corrections, no encouragement, no engagement. It was like watching a military base populated by ghosts, people who were physically present but spiritually absent. Everyone was following regulations to the letter, but there was no life behind the actions, no commitment beyond the minimum required to avoid disciplinary action. A knock at the door interrupted their observations. A young lieutenant entered, his uniform crisp but his eyes already holding the defeated look they had seen in so many faces since arriving. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Morrison, your aide-de-camp," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I have your afternoon briefing schedule, and I wanted to inform you about the situation." "What situation?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Morrison glanced around nervously, as if the walls might be listening. "Well, ma'am, it's traditional for new commanding officers to address the base personnel on their first day. However, the last few COS found the experience challenging." Sarah's patience, never her strongest virtue, began to fray. "Lieutenant, stop dancing around the subject. What exactly happens during these addresses?" The young officer swallowed hard. "They listen, ma'am, very quietly. And they watch. And, after about 10 minutes, most commanding officers realize that they're not really in charge here. The base is in charge. It runs itself, and it doesn't like changes." Rebecca and Sarah exchanged another of their wordless communications. In that brief glance, they reached a decision that would either save their careers or destroy them completely. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned soldiers snap to attention, "I want you to schedule that address for this afternoon. Every person on this base, soldiers, civilians, maintenance staff, kitchen crew, everyone. And I want it held in the main assembly hall." "Ma'am, I should mention that the previous 3 COs held their addresses in smaller venues. The main hall has been avoided since Colonel Hartman's incident." "What incident?" Rebecca demanded. Morrison's face went pale. "Colonel Hartman tried to hold a full base assembly 6 months ago. He got about 5 minutes into his speech when the entire audience just stopped responding. They didn't leave, didn't talk, didn't move. Just sat there staring at him in complete silence. He finished his speech talking to a room full of mannequins, requested transfer that same night." Sarah smiled, but there was nothing warm about the expression. Lieutenant Colonel Hartman made a critical error. He tried to convince them he was in charge. "We're not going to make that mistake." "Ma'am, we're not going to tell them we're in charge," Rebecca explained, moving to her desk and pulling out a notebook. "We're going to show them what being in charge actually looks like." As Morrison left to arrange the assembly, the twins began their real work. They had spent months preparing for this assignment, studying every failed commanding officer, analyzing every incident report, and developing theories about what made Fort Meridian so uniquely toxic. But theories were just theories until tested against reality, and they were about to get their first real taste of what they were up against. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of briefings and introductions, each one more discouraging than the last. Department heads spoke in monotones, presenting statistics that painted a picture of a base operating at minimum efficiency. Training scores were just barely acceptable. Equipment maintenance was perpetually behind schedule, and morale surveys, when anyone bothered to fill them out, read like suicide notes. But beneath the surface dysfunction, Sarah began to detect something else, a sophisticated system of passive resistance that had been refined over decades. It wasn't that the soldiers were actively rebellious. That would have been easier to deal with. Instead, they had perfected the art of malicious compliance, following every order to the letter, while ensuring that nothing actually got accomplished. "It's brilliant in a twisted way," Rebecca observed during their lunch break. "They're not technically disobeying any orders, so there's no grounds for discipline. But they're also not doing anything that might improve the situation. It's like they've turned mediocrity into an art form," Sarah agreed. "But there's something else going on here. This level of coordination doesn't happen naturally. Someone's organizing this resistance." They spent their lunch hour studying personnel files, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal the hidden power structure that really ran Fort Meridian. What they found was even more disturbing than they had expected. Every successful unit, every efficient department, every soldier who showed genuine enthusiasm or competence had been systematically transferred out over the years. What remained was a carefully curated collection of the disaffected, the mediocre, and the bitter, a population specifically selected for their ability to resist change and maintain the status quo. They're not just resisting new commanders, Rebecca realized. They're protecting their territory. This isn't a military base anymore. It's a reservation for military misfits. The afternoon assembly was scheduled for 1500 hours in the main hall, a cavernous space that could hold the base's entire population of 800 personnel. As the twins made their way to the hall, they could feel the weight of anticipation hanging in the air like smoke. Word had traveled fast about the new commanding officer's demand for a full assembly, and speculation was running wild. The main hall itself was an architectural nightmare, a concrete cavern with acoustic properties that seemed designed to make every sound echo ominously. The seating was arranged in military precision, but the space felt more like a courtroom than an auditorium. As Sarah and Rebecca entered from the rear, they could see that every seat was filled, but the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. 800 faces turned to watch them walk down the center aisle, and Sarah felt like she was walking through a gallery of the damned. These weren't the eager faces of soldiers ready to serve their country. These were the expressions of people who had given up hope so long ago they had forgotten what it looked like. The stage at the front of the hall was bare except for a simple podium and 2 chairs. The twins took their positions, Sarah behind the podium, Rebecca standing slightly to her left, and looked out at their audience. The silence stretched on, becoming a contest of wills that would determine the tone of everything that followed. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the hall without amplification. "I know what you're thinking," she began. "Here come 2 more commanders, full of big ideas and grand plans, ready to turn this place around in 30 days or less. You're wondering how long it'll take before we crack under the pressure and request transfers like all the others." A ripple of surprise ran through the audience. Not movement, but a subtle shift in attention that suggested she had caught them off guard. "You're thinking that if you just sit there quietly and wait long enough, we'll go away and leave you alone to continue your perfectly orchestrated campaign of passive resistance." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "And you know what? You're absolutely right to think that, because that's exactly what happened to the 47 officers who came before us." She paused, letting that sink in, watching faces in the crowd for reactions. Most remained carefully neutral, but she caught glimpses of confusion, curiosity, and in a few cases, what might have been the faintest spark of interest. "But here's what you don't know about us." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice carrying a different kind of authority, colder, more analytical, but no less commanding. "We didn't come here to turn this place around. We didn't come here to inspire you, or motivate you, or convince you to care about your jobs." The confusion in the audience was growing now, and Sarah could feel the shift in energy as their carefully prepared resistance strategy encountered something unexpected.
"We came here to study you," Sarah continued.
"You see, Fort Meridian has become famous in certain circles, not for what it accomplishes, but for what it prevents from being accomplished. You've created something unique here. A military installation that has successfully resisted every attempt at reform for 4 decades." She began walking across the stage, her movement drawing eyes and attention like a magnet. "That's not incompetence. That's not accident. That takes planning, coordination, and a level of strategic thinking that most generals would envy." For the first time since entering the hall, Sarah heard sounds from the audience, not talking, but the subtle rustling of people shifting in their seats, the clearing of throats, the whispered word or 2 exchanged between neighbors. "So here's what's going to happen." Rebecca took over, her voice cutting through the growing murmur like a blade. "We're not going to try to change you. We're not going to implement new policies or demand improved performance or threaten disciplinary action against anyone." The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. 800 people held their breath, waiting for the catch they knew had to be coming. "Instead," Sarah said, returning to the podium, "we're going to document everything. Every inefficiency, every workaround, every creative interpretation of regulations that keeps this place running at exactly the level of barely adequate that you've worked so hard to achieve." She gestured toward Rebecca, who had pulled out a recording device and notebook. "My sister and I are going to spend the next year studying your methods, interviewing your personnel, and creating a comprehensive guide to passive resistance in military organizations." The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted their arrival. This wasn't the dead silence of people waiting for something unpleasant to end. This was the electric silence of minds racing, trying to process information that didn't fit any expected pattern. "And when we're done," Rebecca added, "we're going to publish our findings. Fort Meridian, a case study in institutional resistance, will become required reading at every military academy in the country." Sarah could see the moment when understanding began to dawn in faces throughout the crowd. This wasn't another attempt to reform them. It was something far more dangerous. It was the threat of exposure. "You've spent 4 decades perfecting your techniques," Sarah continued. You've created a masterpiece of dysfunction that's invisible to casual observation but devastating to anyone who tries to change it. You should be proud of your accomplishment. She leaned forward on the podium, her green eyes scanning the crowd like a predator evaluating prey. But here's the thing about masterpieces. They're meant to be shared. They're meant to be studied and admired and replicated. The implications hit the audience like a physical blow. Faces that had remained carefully neutral for 40 years suddenly showed emotion, confusion, anger, and most importantly, fear.
Think about it, Rebecca said, her voice gentle but implacable.
Every military installation in America, staffed by people who have read our comprehensive guide to your methods. Every base commander warned about exactly what to look for and how to counter it. Every soldier trained to recognize and report the early signs of institutional resistance. Sarah straightened, her smile returning. Of course, there is an alternative. We could spend our year here learning about something else entirely. We could study what happens when a group of highly skilled military professionals decides to actually apply their talents to their assigned missions. For the first time in decades, Fort Meridian was completely silent in a way that had nothing to do with passive resistance. It was the silence of people realizing that their world was about to change whether they wanted it to or not. The choice is yours, Sarah concluded. You can continue your campaign of perfectly orchestrated mediocrity, and we'll document every technique for the benefit of military leadership everywhere. Or you can show us what this base could accomplish if all that strategic thinking and coordination were applied to actually succeeding instead of just avoiding failure. She stepped back from the podium and Rebecca moved to join her. Together, they stood before 800 people who had just realized that their 40-year winning streak might be coming to an end. Dismissed, Sarah said simply. The word echoed through the hall, but nobody moved. 800 faces stared back at them, processing what they had just heard, calculating odds, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, actually thinking about their futures instead of just enduring their present. Finally, slowly, people began to stand and file out of the hall. But the silence that had been their weapon for so long was broken by the sound of whispered conversations, heated discussions, and the kind of animated debate that hadn't been heard at Fort Meridian since the day it was first commissioned. As the twins watched the last of the audience leave, Sarah turned to her sister. Think it worked? Rebecca was already making notes in her book. Look at them, she said, nodding toward the departing soldiers. They're talking to each other, really talking. Not just going through the motions or following the script. They were right. For the first time in decades, the personnel of Fort Meridian were engaged in genuine discussion about their situation. Some looked angry, others confused, but all of them looked alive in a way that hadn't been seen here for longer than anyone could remember. As they left the assembly hall and walked back toward their quarters, Sarah noticed something else that was different. The soldiers they passed didn't avoid eye contact or hurry past them with studied indifference. Instead, they looked directly at the twins with expressions that ranged from grudging respect to open curiosity.
They're not sure what to make of us yet, Rebecca observed.
Good, Sarah replied. Confusion is better than complacency. At least confused people are thinking. Back in their quarters, the twins spent the evening reviewing what they had learned during their first day. The personnel files spread across their desks painted a clear picture of systematic selection for mediocrity, but they also revealed something else. Underneath all the dysfunction were the bones of what could have been an exceptional military installation. Look at this, Rebecca said, pointing to a file. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the guard who warned us at the gate. 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, expert marksman, communication specialist, and fluent in 4 languages. What's he doing manning a gate in the middle of nowhere? Germany advances. Sarah picked up another file. Staff Sergeant Williams, explosive ordnance disposal expert, graduated top of her class from EOD school, deployed 6 times to Iraq and Afghanistan, currently assigned to inventory management. File after file told the same story. Highly skilled, experienced soldiers whose talents were being completely wasted. It was as if someone had deliberately assembled a collection of the military's best and brightest, then systematically ensured they had no opportunity to excel. This wasn't an accident, Sarah realized. Someone's been collecting talented misfits, people who were too good at their jobs but didn't fit into traditional military culture. The question is, who? Rebecca asked. And more importantly, why? They worked late into the night, building profiles and mapping relationships, trying to understand the hidden structure that really controlled Fort Meridian. What they discovered was both more complex and more disturbing than they had anticipated. At the center of their growing diagram, was a name that appeared in connection with almost every significant decision made at the base over the past 15 years. Command Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez. Officially, she was the senior enlisted advisor to the commanding officer. Unofficially, she appeared to be the puppet master pulling all the strings. "Look at this pattern," Rebecca said, tracing connections on their makeshift organization chart. "Every transfer request approved, every assignment change, every efficiency report, she's involved in all of them. And look at this," Sarah added, pointing to a series of incident reports. Every time a commanding officer tried to implement major changes, there was some kind of accident or emergency that required immediate attention and derailed the reform efforts. Command Sergeant Major Vasquez had been at Fort Meridian for 18 years, longer than any other person currently stationed there. She had arrived as a young staff sergeant and worked her way up through the ranks, gaining influence and authority with each promotion. More importantly, she had been present for the tenure of every single failed commanding officer. "She's not just part of the resistance," Sarah concluded. "She is the resistance. Everything else is just following her lead." As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at their door. Sarah opened it to find Command Sergeant Major Vasquez herself standing in the hallway, her uniform immaculate and her bearing perfect despite the late hour. "Ma'am," she said, her voice respectful but carrying an undertone of something else. Amusement, perhaps, or challenge. "I wondered if I might have a word with you." Sarah stepped aside to let her enter, and Rebecca looked up from her files with interest. Vasquez was exactly what they had expected based on her record. A compact woman in her early 40s with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the economical precision of someone accustomed to command, and her presence filled the room despite her modest height. "Sergeant Major," Rebecca said, not rising from her desk, "we were just reviewing your file. Quite impressive." "Thank you, ma'am." Vasquez's smile was professionally pleasant and completely unreadable. "I wanted to congratulate you on your presentation this afternoon. Very creative." Sarah settled into her chair, studying the older woman carefully. "You don't seem particularly concerned about our plans to document the base's resistance techniques. Should I be?" Vasquez's response was mild, but her eyes were anything but. "Ma'am, I've been here long enough to see every type of commanding officer the Army has to offer. Reformers, disciplinarians, politicians, warriors, they all think they're the first to figure out what's wrong with this place." She moved to the window and looked out at the base spread below them. But here's what none of them understood. Fort Meridian isn't broken. It's working exactly as intended. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged glances. This was the first time anyone had suggested that the base's dysfunction might be deliberate rather than accidental. "Explain," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the full authority of her rank. Vasquez turned back to face them, and for the first time since arriving, the twins felt like they were seeing the real person behind the perfect military facade. "Ma'am, what do you think happens to soldiers who are too good at their jobs but too difficult to manage? Where do you send the brilliant misfits who follow orders perfectly but ask uncomfortable questions? What do you do with the ones who are technically excellent but politically inconvenient?" The answer hung in the air between them like a revelation. "You send them to Fort Meridian," Rebecca breathed. "Exactly." Vasquez's smile was sharp and proud. "This base has been serving as a repository for the Army's most talented troublemakers for over 40 years. We're not failing at our mission. We are the mission." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with almost audible snaps. The resistance isn't about protecting mediocrity. It's about protecting the people who were sent here to be forgotten. "Every commanding officer who comes here tries to fix us," Vasquez continued. "They want to turn us into a normal base with normal soldiers following normal procedures, but normal doesn't work for people like us. Normal is what got us sent here in the first place." She moved closer to their desks, her posture shifting from formal military bearing to something more like that of a conspirator sharing secrets. So we developed our own way of doing things. We follow regulations to the letter, but we interpret them in ways that protect our people. We maintain the minimum standards required to avoid shutdown, but we don't excel enough to attract attention from higher headquarters." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, reassessing everything they thought they knew about their new assignment. "You're running a protection racket disguised as a military base." "We're providing a service," Vasquez corrected. "A place where exceptional soldiers who don't fit the standard mold can serve out their careers with dignity instead of being drummed out of the service or destroyed by a system that doesn't understand them." Sarah stood and began pacing. her mind racing through the implications. The perfect passive resistance, the systematic mediocrity, the way you've broken every commanding officer who tried to change things. It's all been about maintaining this sanctuary. And it's worked, Vasquez said, with evident pride. For 4 decades, we've protected hundreds of soldiers who might otherwise have been lost to the military entirely. We've preserved institutional knowledge, maintained expertise in dozens of specialized fields, and created a community where people can serve without having to pretend to be something they're not. The room fell silent as the twins processed this revelation. Everything they thought they knew about their mission had just been turned upside down. They hadn't been sent to fix a broken base, they had been sent to destroy a functioning ecosystem that someone higher up the chain of command had decided was inconvenient. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked finally. Vasquez's expression became unreadable again. "That depends on you, ma'am. Are you here to preserve what we've built, or are you here to tear it down?" The question hung in the air as the first day at Fort Meridian drew to a close. Outside their window, the base settled into its nighttime routine. But the twins knew that nothing would ever be routine here again. They had come expecting to conquer a dysfunctional military installation, but instead they had discovered something far more complex and morally ambiguous. As Vasquez left them alone with their thoughts and their files, Sarah and Rebecca faced a choice that would define not just their careers, but their consciences. They had been given the power to destroy a 40-year-old sanctuary for military misfits, or to find a way to preserve it while satisfying their superiors' demands for reform. The whispered warnings they had heard about Fort Meridian were starting to make sense. People didn't leave this place because it broke them. They left because it forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the military they served and the choices they were willing to make in the name of duty. The first night at Fort Meridian passed restlessly for the Mitchell twins, filled with dreams of gray corridors and watching eyes, of whispered conversations and unspoken challenges. But when morning came, they rose with the determination that had carried them through 2 decades of military service. They had come to conquer Fort Meridian, but Fort Meridian had shown them something they hadn't expected to find, a reflection of everything that was both wrong and right with the military they had devoted their lives to serving. The real battle was just beginning. The second morning at Fort Meridian began with an incident that would have been impossible just 48 hours earlier. At precisely 0600 hours, as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her quarters for her morning run, she found Master Sergeant Rodriguez waiting for her in the hallway, fully dressed in PT gear and wearing an expression of grim determination. "Ma'am," he said, falling into step beside her as she headed for the stairs, "request permission to accompany you on your morning physical training." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't break stride. "Since when do gate guards accompany commanding officers on their runs, Sergeant?" "Since yesterday afternoon, ma'am." His response was matter-of-fact, as if the entire world had shifted on its axis and everyone was expected to adjust accordingly. "Word's gotten around about your proposal. Some of us figure it's time to stop hiding what we can do." They emerged into the crisp mountain morning to find something that hadn't been seen at Fort Meridian in over a decade. A formation of soldiers waiting to begin PT. Not the mandatory minimally compliant exercises that usually pass for physical training here, but a genuine military formation with proper spacing, alert postures, and the kind of energy that suggested people actually wanted to be there. Rebecca appeared at Sarah's shoulder, already dressed for running and carrying a clipboard. "I count 43 volunteers," she reported quietly, "all from different departments, all with records indicating they were once among the best in their fields." Sarah studied the assembled soldiers, recognizing the faces of people she had seen in personnel files the night before. Staff Sergeant Williams, the explosives expert relegated to inventory management. Sergeant First Class Chen, a former Special Forces medic now working in the motor pool. Technical Sergeant Martinez, a communications specialist with advanced degrees in electronics and computer science, currently assigned to painting buildings. "All right," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the formation. "Here's how this works. We run as a unit, we maintain formation, and we push each other to be better than we were yesterday. Anyone who can't keep up with the pace sets the pace for everyone else until they can do better." It was a simple concept, collective responsibility instead of individual competition. But it hit the assembled soldiers like a revelation. For years they had been encouraged to do just enough to avoid notice, to blend into the background and never stand out. Now they were being asked to excel together, to support each other's success instead of hiding their own capabilities. The run took them along the perimeter road that circled the base, a route that provided views of the surrounding mountains and, more importantly, gave them privacy from the prying eyes of those who hadn't yet chosen sides in the brewing conflict. As they settled into a steady pace, Sarah began to understand something fundamental about the people running beside her. These weren't broken soldiers or military misfits in the traditional sense. These were people who had been too good at their jobs, too willing to speak truth to power, too creative in their problem-solving approaches. They had been sent to Fort Meridian not because they couldn't perform, but because they performed in ways that made their superiors uncomfortable. Sergeant First Class Chen fell into pace beside Rebecca, his breathing steady despite the altitude and pace. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know. What you said yesterday about documenting our methods? Some of the folks are pretty worried about that." "They should be," Rebecca replied without breaking stride. "If you're planning to continue using those methods, then yes, you should be very worried indeed."
Chen glanced at her sharply, trying to read her expression.
"And if we're not planning to continue using them? Then you should be worried about something entirely different," Sarah interjected from Chen's other side. "You should be worried about whether you remember how to be the soldiers you were before you learned to hide." As they completed their circuit of the base, Sarah noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. At various points around the perimeter, small groups of soldiers had gathered to watch them pass. These weren't the volunteers who had joined their formation. These were the others, the ones who had chosen to remain uncommitted to either side of the emerging divide. Their expressions ranged from curious to hostile, but all shared a common element: calculation. They were evaluating, measuring, trying to determine which side was likely to win the coming conflict, and position themselves accordingly. "We're not the only ones who noticed the watchers," Rodriguez commented, as they approached the administration building. "Some of the folks are saying this feels like choosing sides in a civil war." Sarah slowed the formation to a cool-down pace, giving herself time to think. "Sergeant, what would you say if I told you that's exactly what this is?" The question hung in the morning air as they completed their PT session and prepared to face their second day at Fort Meridian. But as the volunteers dispersed to shower and prepare for duty, Sarah noticed that they didn't scatter randomly the way soldiers usually did after formation. Instead, they moved in small groups, talking quietly but intensely, the kind of conversations that meant plans were being made and alliances were being formed. Back in their quarters, the twins found their morning briefing materials had expanded significantly overnight. In addition to the usual reports and schedules, they now had 3 separate folders on their desk. One marked Voluntary Compliance, another labeled Neutral Observers, and a third tagged simply Opposition. "Someone's been busy," Rebecca observed, opening the first folder to reveal detailed profiles of the 43 soldiers who had volunteered for PT that morning. Sarah examined the Opposition folder, finding it significantly thicker than the other 2. Command Sergeant Major Vasquez's intelligence network is impressive. She's got detailed assessments of everyone on base, including predictions about how they'll react to different scenarios. The profiles in the Opposition folder told a disturbing story. These weren't just soldiers who preferred the status quo. These were people who had invested their entire identities in the protective mediocrity that Fort Meridian represented. They weren't resisting change because they were lazy or incompetent. They were resisting it because change represented an existential threat to the only world where they felt safe. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a profile near the bottom of the stack. "Sergeant Phillips, supply clerk. 19 years of service, all of it at installations where his supervisors reported him as adequate but unremarkable. Gets transferred here 3 years ago, and suddenly he's running the most efficiently organized supply depot in the mountain region." Sarah read over her sister's shoulder, understanding immediately. He's not hiding from excellence, he's hiding from attention. He learnt that being noticed meant being criticized, so he developed the skills to be excellent in ways that don't attract notice.
It was a pattern they found repeated throughout the Opposition profiles.
These were soldiers who had been damaged by previous experiences with leadership, people who had learned that standing out meant becoming a target. Fort Meridian's culture of protective invisibility wasn't just a survival mechanism. For many of them, it was the difference between having a military career and having no career at all. Their contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lieutenant Morrison entered, carrying a message pad and wearing an expression of barely controlled panic. "Ma'am, we have a situation developing," he reported, his voice tight with tension. "It started about an hour ago in the communications center." Sarah gestured for him to continue. Already suspecting that their second day was about to become significantly more complicated than their first. "Technical Sergeant Martinez, the communications specialist who was on your PT run this morning, he's been working on some kind of project since he got back from the shower. He's got half the electronics in the building torn apart, and when his supervisor tried to order him to stop, he said he was following the commanding officer's directive to show what this base could accomplish." Rebecca and Sarah exchanged looks. They had hoped for gradual change, careful progress that wouldn't trigger the base's immune system too aggressively. Instead, it sounded like they were about to face an open rebellion in both directions at once.
What exactly is Martinez doing? Sarah asked.
Morrison consulted his notes, his nervousness evident. According to his supervisor, he's attempting to optimize the entire base communications network for maximum efficiency and security. He's been requisitioning equipment, drafting technical specifications, and designing what he calls a communication system worthy of our actual capabilities instead of our pretended limitations. The implications hit both twins simultaneously. Martinez wasn't just improving his assigned duties. He was attempting to revolutionize the entire technical infrastructure of the base. It was exactly the kind of ambitious, high-visibility project that Fort Meridian's culture had been designed to prevent. "Where is Martinez now?" Rebecca asked, already reaching for her jacket. "Still in the communications center, ma'am. His supervisor is afraid to try to stop him, and Command Sergeant Major Vasquez is unavailable." Sarah's instincts, honed by 2 decades of military service, began screaming warnings. Vasquez's absence was not coincidental. It was tactical. She was letting the situation develop without her direct involvement, maintaining plausible deniability while testing how the new commanding officers would handle their first major crisis. The communications center was located in the basement of the administration building, a windowless maze of server rooms and equipment bays that most people on base preferred to avoid. As the twins descended the stairs, they could hear the sounds of serious work in progress, power tools, electronic testing equipment, and the kind of focused conversation that indicated people were solving complex problems in real time. They found Martinez in the central equipment room, surrounded by disassembled communications gear and accompanied by 3 other soldiers, who were clearly working under his direction. The scene looked like organized chaos, but Sarah's trained eye could see the systematic approach underlying the apparent confusion. "Technical Sergeant Martinez," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise of work. Martinez looked up from a partially disassembled radio unit, his face flushed with the kind of excitement that comes from finally being allowed to do work that matters. "Ma'am, perfect timing. I wanted to show you what we've discovered down here." He gestured toward a wall-mounted diagram that hadn't been there the day before, a comprehensive network map showing the base's entire communications infrastructure. But this wasn't the sanitized version that appeared in official documentation. This was a brutally honest assessment that revealed decades of ad hoc patches, workarounds, and deliberate inefficiencies. "Ma'am, this place has been operating on maybe 15% of its actual communications capability," Martinez continued, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his subject. "The equipment we have here could support a base 3 times this size, with redundant systems, encrypted channels, and satellite uplinks that would make Pentagon communications officers jealous." Sarah studied the diagram, beginning to understand the true scope of what Fort Meridian represented. "Why wasn't this capability being used?" "Because using it would have attracted attention," said a voice from behind them. They turned to find Command Sergeant Major Vasquez entering the equipment room, her expression unreadable. "Technical Sergeant Martinez is demonstrating exactly why we've been careful to keep our true capabilities hidden." The tension in the room became palpable as Martinez's enthusiasm collided with Vasquez's carefully controlled concern. This was the moment Sarah had been expecting, the first direct confrontation between the old system and the new possibilities. "Sergeant Major," Rebecca said, her voice deceptively calm, "are you ordering Technical Sergeant Martinez to stop his work?" It was a carefully phrased question that put Vasquez in an impossible position. If she said yes, she would be directly countermanding the commanding officer's directive for the base to demonstrate its true capabilities. If she said no, she would be accepting the dismantling of the protective anonymity that had kept Fort Meridian safe for 4 decades. Vasquez studied the twins for a long moment, and Sarah could almost see her calculating odds and assessing risks. Finally, she spoke, her words chosen with surgical precision. "Ma'am, I'm advising you that Technical Sergeant Martinez's project will require significant resources, will likely attract attention from higher headquarters, and will make it impossible to maintain our current operational security protocols." Sarah smiled, recognizing both the warning and the challenge embedded in Vasquez's response. "Sergeant Major, are you saying that Fort Meridian's personnel are not capable of handling increased attention from higher headquarters?" "I'm saying that attention from higher headquarters has historically not been beneficial to the long-term welfare of this base's personnel," Vasquez replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral despite the underlying steel. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Williams, the explosives expert who had been reassigned to inventory management. She appeared in the doorway of the equipment room, slightly out of breath, and carrying a folder thick with documentation. "Ma'am," she addressed Sarah directly, "I need to report a situation developing in the supply depot. Sergeant Phillips has barricaded himself in the warehouse and is refusing to allow anyone access to critical equipment and materials." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized the conflict was spreading beyond the communications center. What kind of materials? Williams consulted her folder. Everything Martinez requisitioned for his communications project, plus about half the electronic components on base. Phillips is claiming that unauthorized equipment redistribution violates Regulation 725.50 and that he's protecting base property from misappropriation. Rebecca stepped forward, her analytical mind already working through the implications. He's using regulations as weapons, creating legitimate bureaucratic obstacles that will slow down or stop any changes. It's a classic defensive strategy, Vasquez observed. And despite the tension in the room, there was a note of professional admiration in her voice. Sergeant Phillips is protecting the status quo by making change prohibitively difficult to implement. Sarah found herself caught between admiration and frustration. The level of strategic thinking being demonstrated by both sides was impressive, but it was also threatening to tear the base apart before anyone had a chance to find a sustainable solution. "All right," she said, her voice carrying the authority of command decision. "Here's what's going to happen. Technical Sergeant Martinez, you will continue your communications project, but you will coordinate all resource requests through proper channels. Staff Sergeant Williams, you will work with Sergeant Phillips to resolve the supply depot situation using standard military procedures for conflicting priority assignments." She turned to face Vasquez directly. "Sergeant Major, you will ensure that all personnel understand that following regulations is mandatory, but using regulations to sabotage legitimate operations is grounds for disciplinary action." The silence that followed her pronouncement was heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah had just drawn clear battle lines while simultaneously trying to prevent the battle from destroying everything worth preserving at Fort Meridian. As the group dispersed to implement her orders, Martinez approached Sarah with an expression of barely contained excitement mixed with concern. "Ma'am, there's something else you need to know about the communications project." Sarah waited, suspecting that whatever came next would complicate an already complex situation. "While I was analyzing the existing network infrastructure, I discovered something that's not in any of the official documentation," Martinez continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "This base has been serving as a relay point for communications traffic that has nothing to do with our assigned mission." The implications of that statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What kind of communications traffic?" Martinez glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then pulled up a data screen on one of his monitoring devices. "Encrypted transmissions between various military installations across 3 time zones. Intelligence briefings, operational reports, personnel transfers. It looks like Fort Meridian has been functioning as a hidden hub for sensitive communications that bypass normal command channels." Rebecca joined them, studying the data over Martinez's shoulder. "This isn't just a sanctuary for misfit soldiers. This is a shadow communications network operating outside official oversight." The pieces of the puzzle were rearranging themselves into a picture that was far more complex than anything the twins had imagined. Fort Meridian wasn't just protecting individual soldiers, it was protecting information, operations, and possibly entire programs that someone wanted kept away from traditional military bureaucracy. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah asked. Martinez consulted his data logs. "Based on the equipment installation dates and upgrade patterns, I'd estimate at least 15 years, possibly longer. But here's the really interesting part. The traffic volume has been increasing significantly over the past 5 years." Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into depths she couldn't fully comprehend. Every answer they uncovered revealed 3 new questions, each more troubling than the last. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Morrison, who appeared in the equipment room doorway with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Ma'am, we have multiple situations developing simultaneously," he reported, consulting a series of handwritten notes. "The supply depot standoff is attracting crowds of observers. The communications project is generating equipment requisitions that are backing up the entire procurement system, and we've got reports of unofficial meetings taking place in at least 6 different locations around the base." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the cascading implications. In less than 24 hours, their attempt to encourage gradual change had triggered what appeared to be the beginning of a base-wide crisis. "Lieutenant, I want you to schedule individual meetings with the leaders of each faction. she said finally. Not group meetings, individual private conversations. And I want them scheduled in neutral locations, not in anyone's office or workspace. Ma'am, how do I identify the faction leaders? It was Vasquez who answered, her voice carrying a note of grudging respect. Lieutenant, by now everyone on this base knows exactly who's leading what. The question isn't identifying them, it's getting them to agree to meet. As Morrison left to arrange the meetings, Sarah found herself alone with Vasquez and Martinez in the equipment room. The three of them represented the past, present, and future of Fort Meridian, and the tension between their different visions was palpable. Sergeant Major, Sarah said finally, I need to understand something. When you told us last night that this base was working exactly as intended, whose intentions were you referring to? Vasquez's expression became even more carefully controlled. Ma'am, I think that's a conversation that needs to happen in a more private setting, with better security protocols in place. Sarah studied the older woman's face, recognizing the signs of someone who possessed dangerous knowledge and was trying to decide whether to share it. Tonight, then. My quarters after evening formation. And Sergeant Major? Bring documentation. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of crisis management and damage control. The supply depot situation was resolved through a compromise that satisfied no one but prevented escalation. Martinez's communications project was scaled back to more manageable proportions, though he made it clear that what he was revealing was only the tip of the iceberg. Most concerning were the reports of unauthorized meetings taking place throughout the base. Small groups of soldiers were gathering in break rooms, maintenance sheds, and other informal spaces, conducting intense discussions about loyalty, change, and the future of their sanctuary. By evening formation, it was clear that Fort Meridian was no longer the same place it had been just 2 days earlier. The carefully maintained facade of dutiful mediocrity was cracking, revealing the complex ecosystem of competing interests and hidden agendas that lay beneath. Sarah stood before the assembled base personnel, looking out at faces that showed everything from excitement to fear to grim determination. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were people who had been forced to choose sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Over the past 2 days, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. This base has demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything in our official records. We've also demonstrated divisions that threaten to tear apart 40 years of careful community building. She paused, letting that observation sink in before continuing. Tomorrow, we begin the process of finding a path forward that preserves what's worth preserving while building something better than what we've had. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, and it will require everyone to be better than they've had to be for a very long time. As the formation dispersed, Sarah noticed that people weren't leaving in the usual random patterns. Instead, they were clustering into distinct groups: the volunteers who had joined morning PT, the neutrals who were still deciding which way to jump, and the resistance members who saw change as an existential threat. The battle lines were drawn, but the war for Fort Meridian's soul was just beginning. That evening, as promised, Command Sergeant Major Vasquez arrived at the twins' quarters carrying a locked briefcase and wearing the expression of someone about to reveal state secrets. She checked the windows, examined the doors, and even ran a small electronic device around the room, before finally settling into a chair across from their desks. What I'm about to tell you is not in any official record, she began, opening the briefcase to reveal thick folders and what appeared to be recording equipment. Fort Meridian's real mission has been classified above your clearance level since before you were born. Sergeant Major, are you sure you want to do this? Vasquez's smile was sharp and sad. Ma'am, after 40 years of keeping secrets, I'm tired, and more importantly, the situation has evolved beyond what the original planners anticipated. She pulled out the first folder and spread its contents across the desk. Photographs, documents, organizational charts, the hidden history of Fort Meridian laid bare. In 1982, when this base was reactivated, it wasn't just to provide a dumping ground for problem soldiers, Vasquez began. It was to create a deniable asset, a military installation that could handle sensitive operations without leaving official fingerprints. The photograph showed Fort Meridian during its early years of reactivation. But instead of the run-down, barely functional facility it appeared to be, these images revealed a sophisticated operation with cutting-edge equipment and personnel who were clearly anything but mediocre. The plan was elegant, Vasquez continued. Create a base that appeared dysfunctional to casual observation but was actually highly capable. Staff it with soldiers who had the skills to handle sensitive missions but were politically inconvenient to their previous commands. Develop a cover story that would discourage outside interest while providing operational flexibility.
Rebecca leaned forward, studying the documents with growing amazement.
This is incredible. You're running a Black Ops facility disguised as a military disaster. Were running, Vasquez corrected, past tense. The original mission ended 3 years ago when the programs we supported were transferred to other agencies. But by then, Fort Meridian had developed its own momentum. She pulled out another set of documents, these showing communications logs, transfer orders, and personnel files, that painted a picture of an operation slowly transforming from covert military asset to something else entirely. The soldiers who had been assigned here for operational reasons stayed because they had nowhere else to go. The protective culture we had developed to maintain operational security became a genuine sanctuary for people who didn't fit anywhere else in the military. Sarah studied a personnel transfer chart that showed the evolution of Fort Meridian's population over 2 decades. So the dysfunction we've been observing isn't a failure of military discipline. It's the remnant of a successful deception operation that outlived its original purpose.
Exactly, Vasquez confirmed.
And that's why your arrival has created such a crisis. For the first time in 40 years, we have commanding officers who are smart enough and determined enough to see through the deception to the reality underneath.
The room fell silent as the implications sank in.
Everything they thought they understood about their mission had just been revealed as layers of misdirection and institutional momentum that had accumulated over decades. Sergeant Major, Rebecca said finally, what happened to the oversight for the original mission? Someone had to be monitoring a facility handling sensitive operations. Vasquez's expression became even more carefully controlled. That's where the story gets complicated, ma'am. And dangerous. She pulled out the final folder, this one marked with classification stamps that made Sarah's blood run cold. The oversight structure for Fort Meridian's original mission was compartmentalized through 3 different agencies, none of which had complete information about what the others were doing. The documents showed a bewildering maze of command relationships, funding sources, and reporting requirements that seemed designed to ensure that no single person or organization could piece together the full picture of Fort Meridian's activities. When the original mission ended, each oversight agency assumed another agency was handling the transition, Vasquez continued. The result was that Fort Meridian fell through the cracks, officially deactivated from its covert mission but never officially reassigned to standard military operations. Sarah felt like she was looking at a bureaucratic nightmare that had become a living reality. So for the past 3 years, this base has been operating in a legal and organizational limbo.
Worse than that, Vasquez replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper.
6 months ago, we received an inquiry from an Inspector General's office about irregularities in resource allocation and personnel assignments. Someone is finally starting to ask the right questions. Rebecca stood and began pacing, her mind working through the implications at high speed.
That's why you've been so resistant to change.
You're not just protecting a sanctuary for misfit soldiers, you're protecting everyone here from an investigation that could destroy careers and possibly result in criminal charges. The beautiful irony, Vasquez said with bitter humor, is that our campaign of protective mediocrity has been the only thing standing between us and a scandal that would make headlines for months. The twins sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that their mission to reform Fort Meridian was actually a threat to the survival of everyone stationed there. The dysfunction they had been sent to fix was the only thing preventing a catastrophic exposure of decades of unauthorized operations. So, what do you want from us? Sarah asked finally. Vasquez gathered up her documents and returned them to the briefcase with movements that spoke of long practice in handling classified materials. I want you to understand what you're really dealing with before you decide how far you're willing to push for change. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Ma'am, the soldiers who volunteered for your PT formation this morning? They're not just risking their careers by choosing to excel again. Given our actual situation, they might be risking their freedom. After Vasquez left, the twins sat in their quarters surrounded by the weight of knowledge they weren't sure they wanted to possess. Outside their window, Fort Meridian looked exactly the same as it had when they arrived, a collection of unremarkable buildings housing an apparently dysfunctional military operation. But now they knew the truth that lay beneath the surface, a community of highly skilled soldiers living in a protection racket disguised as institutional failure, built on the foundation of a Black Ops facility that had been abandoned by its creators and forgotten by its overseers. The whispered warnings they had heard about Fort Meridian were starting to make perfect sense. This wasn't a place that broke commanding officers through incompetence or resistance. It was a place that forced them to choose between their duty to reform and their duty to protect the people under their command. As the second night at Fort Meridian settled over the base, Sarah and Rebecca faced a choice that would define not just their careers, but the lives of 800 soldiers who had found sanctuary in the shadows of military bureaucracy. The easy path would be to withdraw their demands for change, accept the protective dysfunction, and become part of the conspiracy of silence that had kept Fort Meridian safe for decades. But easy paths had never appealed to the Mitchell twins, and this situation was far too complex for simple solutions.
Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new tests of exactly how far they were willing to go to fulfill a mission they were finally beginning to understand.
Fort Meridian had whispered its secrets, but the choice of what to do with those secrets remained entirely in their hands.
The battle for Fort Meridian's soul was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The third day at Fort Meridian began with an emergency that would have been impossible just 72 hours earlier. At 0430 hours, Sarah Mitchell was awakened by the sound of her secure phone ringing with the insistent tone that indicated a priority communication from higher headquarters.
Colonel Mitchell, she answered, instantly alert despite the early hour.
Sarah, this is General Patterson. We have a situation. The general's voice carried the kind of tension that made career officers break into cold sweats. I'm looking at a preliminary report from a signals intelligence sweep that was conducted yesterday. Are you aware that Fort Meridian has been operating unauthorized communications equipment? Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as she realized that Martinez's communications project had triggered exactly the kind of attention that Vasquez had warned her about. Sir, I can explain. Colonel, I don't want explanations over an unsecured line, Patterson interrupted. I want solutions. You have incoming visitors, a 3-person team from the Inspector General's office, plus a signals intelligence specialist from NSA. They'll be at your location within 6 hours. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in the pre-dawn darkness. She quickly woke Rebecca, and within minutes they were both dressed and headed for the communications center, knowing that they were about to face the crisis that Fort Meridian had been avoiding for decades. They found Martinez already in the equipment room, working frantically to reconfigure his communications array. But instead of dismantling his improvements, he was expanding them, adding layers of encryption and security that transformed the base's communications capability from impressive to extraordinary.
Technical Sergeant, what are you doing? Rebecca demanded, though she could see the answer displayed on multiple monitoring screens around the room.
Martinez looked up from his work, his face flushed with the kind of desperate energy that comes from racing against impossible odds. Ma'am, when the signals intelligence sweep hit us yesterday, I realized we had maybe 12 hours before someone would come looking for answers. So I'm giving them answers they won't expect. He gestured toward his expanded array of equipment and monitoring stations. If they're coming here expecting to find unauthorized communications gear, they're going to find the most sophisticated, most secure, most impressively legitimate communications installation outside of the Pentagon. Sarah stared at the transformation that had taken place overnight. The basement communications center had been converted into something that looked like it belonged in a movie about high-tech military operations. Banks of monitors displaying encrypted data streams, satellite uplink systems that hadn't been there the day before, and security protocols that were normally reserved for facilities handling the nation's most sensitive intelligence. Martinez, where did all this equipment come from? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would be as unsettling as everything else about Fort Meridian. Ma'am, it was all here already, Martinez replied, his hands never stopping their work on a particularly complex encryption module. Hidden in storage rooms, disguised as broken equipment, distributed across different departments to avoid detection. I just reassembled it into its intended configuration. Rebecca moved to one of the monitoring stations, studying displays that showed communication links to military installations she didn't even recognize. This is the infrastructure for the Black Ops missions Vasquez told us about last night. Yes, ma'am, but that's not all it is, Martinez said, pulling up a different set of displays. While I was bringing the system online, I discovered that it's also been serving as a backup communications network for legitimate military operations. If the primary communications systems at any of these installations fail, Fort Meridian automatically becomes their fallback relay point. The implications hit Sarah like a series of physical blows. Fort Meridian wasn't just a forgotten relic of discontinued covert operations. It was a critical but unacknowledged component of current military communications infrastructure. How many installations are we talking about? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Martinez consulted a status display that showed communication links spanning the continental United States. 47 military installations, 12 intelligence agencies, and 6 civilian government departments. Ma'am, If this communications hub went offline permanently, it would create coordination failures across multiple critical defense operations. Sarah closed her eyes, finally understanding the true scope of what they were dealing with. Fort Meridian hadn't been abandoned by its creators. It had evolved into something too important to shut down, but too sensitive to acknowledge officially. Their analysis was interrupted by the arrival of Command Sergeant Major Vasquez, who entered the communications center carrying a folder and wearing the expression of someone about to deliver very bad news. "Ma'am, we have multiple developing situations," she reported. "First, the inspection team's arrival has been moved up. They'll be here in 3 hours, not 6. Sarah felt her stress level ratchet up another notch. "What else?" "Second, word about the inspection has leaked to base personnel. We're seeing the beginning of what appears to be coordinated action by multiple factions." Vasquez opened her folder, revealing a series of photographs taken around the base over the past hour. Sarah studied them with growing amazement and alarm. In every image, soldiers were engaged in activities that demonstrated their true capabilities. Equipment maintenance that had been deferred for years was being completed in hours. Training exercises were being conducted at levels of intensity not seen in decades, and administrative processes were being streamlined with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine.
"They're not hiding anymore," Rebecca observed.
"They've decided to show everyone what they're really capable of." "It gets more complicated," Vasquez continued, producing another set of photographs. "The resistance faction has also mobilized. They're implementing every bureaucratic obstacle they can think of to prevent the inspection team from getting a clear picture of our actual capabilities." The second set of images showed the flip side of the coin. Soldiers creating paperwork mountains, initiating equipment safety inspections that would take days to complete, and discovering urgent maintenance requirements that would require immediate attention and make large portions of the base inaccessible to visitors. Sarah studied both sets of photographs, beginning to understand that Fort Meridian was about to tear itself apart in front of official witnesses who were already suspicious about what they might find.
"How many people know about the inspection?" she asked.
"Everyone," Vasquez replied simply. "Ma'am, there are no secrets on a military base this size. By now, every person here has chosen a strategy for dealing with what's coming." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications, reaching a decision that would either save Fort Meridian or destroy it completely. "All right," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of command decision. "Here's what's going to happen. Technical Sergeant Martinez, you will continue preparing the communications center for inspection, but you will also prepare a complete briefing on our communications role in supporting other military installations." She turned to Vasquez. "Sergeant Major, I want you to call an immediate all-hands assembly. Everyone on this base, regardless of faction or position. And I want it held in the main assembly hall." Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you sure that's wise? The last time we tried to get all the factions in the same room was 2 days ago, before everyone understood what's really at stake," Sarah interrupted. "Today is different. Today we're not asking people to choose sides. We're asking them to choose whether Fort Meridian survives or dies." The assembly hall filled more quickly than it had for the twins' first address to base personnel, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the dead silence of passive resistance, the hall buzzed with the kind of urgent conversation that indicated people were actively engaged with their situation. As Sarah and Rebecca took the stage, they looked out at 800 faces that showed everything from determination to fear to grim resignation. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a community preparing for battle. 3 hours from now," Sarah began without preamble, "an inspection team will arrive at Fort Meridian expecting to find evidence of unauthorized communications activities, personnel mismanagement, and operational inefficiencies." The buzzing conversation stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. 800 people held their breath, waiting to hear their fate. "They're going to find all of those things," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "But they're also going to find the truth about what Fort Meridian really represents." Sarah moved to the center of the stage, her presence commanding attention from every person in the hall. "Over the past 3 days, we've discovered that this base has been serving functions that go far beyond anything in our official mission statement. We've also discovered that the people stationed here possess capabilities that exceed anything in our personnel records." She paused, studying faces in the crowd and seeing the moment when understanding began to dawn. "The inspection team is coming here expecting to find a failed military installation that needs to be shut down or completely reorganized. What they're going to find instead is evidence that Fort Meridian has been successfully fulfilling critical but unacknowledged roles in national defense for over 40 years. The silence that followed was electric, with possibility and terror in equal measure. For the first time in decades, the people of Fort Meridian were being asked not to hide their capabilities, but to reveal them to the very authorities they had been hiding from. "Here's what's going to happen," Rebecca said, taking over from her sister. "When the inspection team arrives, they're going to see a military installation operating at peak efficiency, with personnel who are demonstrably among the best in their fields, supporting communications and logistics operations that are critical to national security." She gestured toward Martinez, who had appeared at the side of the stage carrying a folder thick with documentation. "Technical Sergeant Martinez will brief them on our communications infrastructure and its role in supporting 47 other military installations. Command Sergeant Major Vasquez will provide them with personnel records that document the actual qualifications and capabilities of everyone stationed here." Sarah stepped forward again, her voice taking on the tone of someone issuing orders that would be obeyed without question. "And every person in this hall will demonstrate why they were assigned to Fort Meridian. Not because they were problems to be hidden, but because they were assets too valuable to waste on conventional assignments." The transformation that followed was unlike anything in the base's 4-decade history. As the assembly dispersed, soldiers moved with a kind of purpose and precision that spoke of years of suppressed professionalism finally being allowed to surface. Sarah watched from the assembly hall's windows as Fort Meridian underwent a metamorphosis that seemed almost magical in its speed and thoroughness. Equipment that hadn't functioned properly in years was suddenly operating at peak efficiency. Facilities that had looked run down and neglected were being transformed into showcase examples of military precision and capability. In the motor pool, Staff Sergeant Chen was demonstrating vehicle maintenance techniques that turned routine repairs into masterclasses in mechanical excellence. The communications center had become a high-tech command hub that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. Even the mess hall was operating with the kind of efficiency and attention to detail that would have impressed Pentagon inspectors. But the most remarkable transformation was in the people themselves. Soldiers who had spent years hiding their capabilities were suddenly moving with the confidence and bearing of elite military professionals. The deadness in their eyes had been replaced by the sharp focus of people who were finally being allowed to do work that mattered.
"It's like watching a military base wake up from a 40-year coma,"
Rebecca observed, studying the activity through binoculars. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on a different aspect of the transformation. "Look at how they're coordinating," she said, pointing to various groups of soldiers working around the base. "There's no confusion, no wasted effort, no overlap. They're functioning like a unit that's been training together for decades." It was true. Despite the rapid pace of change and the complexity of the operations being conducted simultaneously across the base, everything was proceeding with clockwork precision. Supplies appeared exactly where they were needed, personnel moved between tasks with practiced efficiency, and complex technical operations were being completed ahead of schedule. "They have been training together for decades," Vasquez's voice came from behind them. She had approached so quietly that neither twin had noticed her arrival, a reminder that even the most administrative personnel at Fort Meridian possessed skills that went far beyond their apparent duties. "Sergeant Major," Sarah said without turning around, "are you satisfied with the base's preparation for inspection?" "Ma'am, I'm terrified," Vasquez replied with brutal honesty. "What you're seeing out there represents the collective capabilities of some of the most skilled military professionals in the country. If the inspection team recognizes what they're looking at, it's going to raise questions that none of us are prepared to answer." Rebecca lowered her binoculars and faced Vasquez directly. "What kind of questions?" "Questions like, why were personnel with these capabilities assigned to an installation with no official mission that could utilize them? Questions like, how did equipment worth millions of dollars end up at a base that's supposed to be a dumping ground for obsolete gear? Questions like, what has Fort Meridian really been doing for the past 40 years, and who authorized it?" The weight of those implications settled over the twins like a heavy blanket. They had succeeded in mobilizing Fort Meridian's hidden capabilities, but in doing so, they had exposed everyone on the base to scrutiny that could destroy careers and potentially result in criminal charges. "Ma'am," Vasquez continued, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone, "there's something else you need to know before the inspection team arrives. I've been in contact with some people who were involved in Fort Meridian's original mission structure." Sarah turned sharply, her instincts warning her that whatever came next would be significant.
"What kind of people?" "The kind who don't officially exist anymore," Vasquez replied. "They've been monitoring the situation here since the signals intelligence sweep detected our communications activity."
"They're concerned about what an official investigation might uncover." Rebecca stepped closer, her voice taking on the edge that indicated she was prepared for bad news. Concerned enough to do what? Vasquez pulled out a secure communication device that looked nothing like standard military equipment. Concerned enough to authorize me to implement emergency protocols that have been dormant for over 20 years. The device in Vasquez's hands represented possibilities that the twins weren't sure they wanted to contemplate. Emergency protocols from Black Ops programs were notorious for prioritizing security over individual welfare, and the people who had designed them were not known for their concern about collateral damage. What kind of emergency protocols? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would be unpalatable. The kind that make problems disappear permanently, Vasquez replied. The kind that ensure certain information never becomes public knowledge, regardless of the cost to the people involved. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Morrison, who burst through the assembly hall doors with the kind of barely controlled panic that indicated their time for preparation had run out. "Ma'am, the inspection team has arrived ahead of schedule," he announced, his voice tight with stress. "They're at the main gate now, and they're requesting immediate access to all base facilities and personnel." There felt time accelerate around her as the moment of truth arrived, faster than anyone had expected. Through the assembly hall windows, she could see a convoy of official vehicles approaching the administration building, their occupants undoubtedly armed with questions, authority, and the power to destroy everything Fort Meridian had become. "All right," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had served her through 2 decades of military crises. "Sergeant Major, I want you to put those emergency protocols on standby, but do not implement them unless I give you direct authorization." She turned to Morrison. "Lieutenant, inform the inspection team that the commanding officers will meet them in the main conference room in 15 minutes. Full dress uniforms, complete courtesy, total transparency." As Morrison left to relay the message, Sarah and Rebecca faced the final decision that would determine the fate of 800 people who had trusted them with their futures.
"We could still back down," Rebecca said quietly. "Tell the inspection team that we've identified some irregularities, but that they're being corrected through normal administrative channels." Sarah considered the option for exactly 3 seconds before rejecting it.
"No. These people deserve better than to spend the rest of their careers hiding in the shadows. They deserve to be recognized for what they actually accomplish." The main conference room had been transformed into something that would have impressed corporate executives, let alone military inspectors. The walls displayed charts and graphs showing Fort Meridian's actual performance metrics, communications capabilities, and personnel qualifications. Technical displays demonstrated the base's role in supporting other military installations, while documentation tables provided evidence of everything the inspection team could possibly want to review. The inspection team itself consisted of exactly the kind of people Sarah had expected. Career military officers with the sharp eyes and skeptical expressions of professionals who had seen every type of cover-up and misdirection the military could produce. They entered the conference room with the wariness of bomb disposal experts approaching an unexploded device. The team leader, a colonel with an inspector general's badge and 3 decades of experience written in the lines of his face, studied the room's displays with the attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the neutral tone of someone who had learned not to show surprise. "I'm Colonel Harrison. Inspector General's Office. This is Major Peters from Signals Intelligence and Captain Rodriguez from Personnel Systems. We're here to investigate reports of unauthorized communications activities and personnel management irregularities." Sarah stepped forward, her bearing perfect and her voice steady. "Colonel Harrison, we're prepared to provide you with complete access to all base facilities, personnel records, and operational documentation. But first, I think you need to understand what you're actually investigating." She gestured toward the displays around the room. Fort Meridian has been serving as a critical but unacknowledged component of military communications infrastructure for over 15 years. We currently provide backup communications support for 47 military installations and serve as a relay point for sensitive communications traffic that requires enhanced security protocols. Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see him processing implications at high speed. "Colonel, are you telling me that this base has been conducting unauthorized operations?"
"No, sir." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice carrying the precision of someone presenting carefully prepared facts.
"I'm telling you that this base has been conducting operations that were authorized through compartmentalized command structures that failed to maintain proper coordination when missions evolved." Major Peters, the Signals Intelligence Specialist, moved to one of the technical displays and began studying the communications network diagrams with obvious professional interest.
This is impressive.
"The encryption protocols alone represent capabilities I've only seen at NSA installations. Major." Martinez appeared at his shoulder,
wearing dress uniform and carrying documentation that transformed him from a building painter into the communications expert he had always been. I'd be happy to brief you on our technical capabilities and their integration with national defense communications networks. What followed was a demonstration that redefined everything the inspection team thought they knew about Fort Meridian. Martinez walked them through communication systems that rivaled anything in the Pentagon. Chen showed them maintenance capabilities that exceeded the standards of elite special operations units. Williams demonstrated explosives handling expertise that would have been impressive in a bomb disposal unit, but it was the personnel records that really captured the inspection team's attention. File after file revealed soldiers whose official assignments bore no relationship to their actual qualifications. PhDs in computer science assigned to kitchen duty, former Special Forces operators working in supply management, intelligence analysts with top-secret clearances maintaining buildings. Colonel Mitchell, Harrison said finally, his professional composure beginning to crack. What I'm seeing here suggests that Fort Meridian has been serving as some kind of repository for highly qualified personnel who were placed here for reasons that aren't reflected in official documentation. Sarah had been preparing for this moment since the day she arrived at Fort Meridian. Colonel Harrison, I believe what you're seeing is evidence that the military has been inefficiently utilizing some of its most valuable human resources due to bureaucratic compartmentalization and inadequate coordination between different command structures. It was a carefully crafted response that acknowledged the problem without admitting to any wrongdoing. Harrison studied her for a long moment, clearly recognizing the diplomatic dance they were performing. And your solution to this? Inefficient utilization? He asked. Rebecca stepped forward with a folder that represented weeks of careful planning and analysis. Sir, we propose the establishment of Fort Meridian as an official special operations support installation with a mission to provide specialized communications, logistics, and technical support to sensitive military operations. The proposal she handed to Harrison was a masterpiece of military bureaucracy, a comprehensive plan that would legitimize everything Fort Meridian had been doing unofficially while providing oversight structures that would satisfy regulatory requirements. Harrison spent 20 minutes reviewing the proposal, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he understood both its brilliance and its audacity. Finally, he closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah. Colonel Mitchell, this proposal would require approval at levels far above my authority. It would also require a complete reorganization of command structures, funding mechanisms, and operational oversight.
Yes, sir, Sarah replied. It would also provide official recognition and proper support for capabilities that are currently being maintained through improvisation and personal dedication. The room fell silent as Harrison weighed options that all carried significant risks.
He could recommend shutdown of Fort Meridian, but that would eliminate communications and technical capabilities that were clearly being used by other military installations. He could recommend maintaining the status quo, but that would perpetuate a situation that violated numerous regulations and accountability requirements. Or he could forward their proposal up the chain of command and let senior leadership decide whether Fort Meridian's irregular evolution had produced something worth preserving. Colonel Mitchell, he said finally, I'm going to recommend a 6-month provisional period during which Fort Meridian will operate under enhanced oversight, while the Department of Defense evaluates your proposal for official mission redesignation. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension wash over her. 6 months would give them time to prove that Fort Meridian deserved official recognition, but it would also put everyone on the base under intense scrutiny during that entire period. Thank you, sir, she replied. We won't disappoint you. The inspection team spent 3 more days at Fort Meridian, documenting capabilities, interviewing personnel, and trying to understand how a base that appeared dysfunctional on paper could actually be performing functions that were critical to national defense. What they found was a community of exceptional professionals who had been systematically underutilized by traditional military bureaucracy, but had found ways to serve their country's interests despite official neglect. They discovered communication systems that provided redundancy and security for sensitive operations. They found maintenance and logistics capabilities that exceeded the standards of much larger installations. Most importantly, they found people who were finally being allowed to demonstrate their true worth. On their final day at Fort Meridian, Colonel Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation that would determine the base's ultimate fate. Colonel Mitchell, he said, his tone more personal than official, I want you to understand something. What you've accomplished here in 1 week should have been impossible. Military institutions don't change this rapidly or this thoroughly. Sarah nodded, understanding that he was trying to process something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how military organizations functioned. The truth is, Harrison continued,
Fort Meridian never needed to be fixed. It needed to be understood. You didn't change these people, you just gave them permission to be who they always were. He handed her a sealed envelope that contained the preliminary findings he would be submitting to his superiors. My recommendation is going to be that Fort Meridian represents a successful example of adaptive military organization that deserves official recognition and support. The entire base gathered to watch their convoy disappear down the mountain road. For the first time in 40 years, the people of Fort Meridian didn't have to hide from official attention. They could take pride in what they had accomplished. Sarah and Rebecca stood before the assembled base personnel, looking out at faces that showed confidence, purpose, and hope for the future. 6 months from now, Sarah announced, her voice carrying clearly across the formation, Fort Meridian will either be officially recognized as a special operations support installation, or it will be shut down permanently. The silence that followed was not the dead silence of passive resistance or the electric silence of suppressed conflict. It was the focused silence of professionals preparing to prove their worth to anyone who cared to judge them. Either way, Rebecca added, we will spend those 6 months demonstrating why the United States military needs Fort Meridian and why Fort Meridian needs every person standing in this formation. As the formation dispersed, Sarah noticed that people weren't clustering into the factional groups that had defined base politics for so long. Instead, they were moving with the coordinated purpose of a unit that understood its mission and was committed to succeeding. Command Sergeant Major Vasquez approached the twins as they prepared to return to their quarters. Ma'am, she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been gratitude. I wanted you to know that the emergency protocols I mentioned earlier, I've recommended that they be permanently deactivated. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Why? Vasquez's smile was genuine for the first time since they had met her. Because Fort Meridian doesn't need to hide anymore. We've got something worth showing the world. That evening, as Sarah and Rebecca reviewed the events of their first week at Fort Meridian, they realized that they had accomplished something that neither of them had expected when they accepted this assignment. They hadn't just reformed a dysfunctional military installation, they had revealed that the dysfunction had been a protective camouflage hiding exceptional capabilities that were being systematically wasted by bureaucratic inertia and institutional fear. The whispered warnings they had received about Fort Meridian had been accurate, but incomplete. This place did break commanding officers who tried to change it through conventional methods, but it rewarded leaders who were willing to understand it, to recognize the value of what existed beneath the surface, and to find ways to let that value shine. 6 months later, Fort Meridian received official designation as a Special Operations Support Installation, with a mission to provide specialized technical and communications support to sensitive military operations. The personnel who had spent decades hiding their capabilities became the foundation of one of the military's most effective and innovative units. But more importantly, they proved that sometimes the most valuable assets are the ones that don't fit into standard categories, and that exceptional organizations can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, when leadership has the courage to see potential instead of just problems. The twin sisters who had crushed a base in just 2 nights had actually done something far more challenging. They had rebuilt it from the inside out, transforming a sanctuary for military misfits into a showcase of what the military could accomplish when it stopped trying to force people into inappropriate roles and started finding ways to utilize their actual talents. Fort Meridian's 40-year experiment in protective mediocrity had ended, but its future as a center of excellence was just beginning. The whispered warnings had been replaced by whispered admiration, and the base that everyone had been told to stay away from became the place where the military's most challenging problems got solved, by people who understood that being different wasn't the same as being broken. In the end, Sarah and Rebecca Mitchell had learned that sometimes the best way to crush resistance is to understand what that resistance is trying to protect, and then find better ways to provide that protection while still achieving your mission. Fort Meridian had taught them that leadership isn't about forcing change on unwilling people. It's about creating conditions where people choose to change because they finally have the opportunity to become who they were always meant to be. They whispered, "Stay away." The twin sisters who crushed a base in just 2 nights.